sort of happy.
Oh, happy, yes, I remember that. No, not that I know.
You've never been stung by a bee, have you?
No.
You know, bees are genetically designed to recognize royalty.
Oh, now we know. Now we know. Now we know. Now we know.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this second episode of Now We Know. And this time around, I have my good friend Marshall from social media. Last night, we recorded a discussion the two of us had of navigating the regime, which is a way of describing the predicament of the political predicament of the West as it is now, and ways of navigating it, and it's the very cynical outlook that we both have to it, but also ways of overcoming that and ultimately finding ways to live a good life despite it. And our most immediate inspiration comes from some readings we both did of 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 and 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶𝗺, I think is how you pronounce his name, in their particular interpretations of these extremely modern, extremely advanced ways that regimes are, contrasted with more traditional ones. And yeah, so I will just play that for you now. Enjoy. And we've started. Right. Hello. Welcome to the discussion, and I'm here with Marshall. I'll just call him Marshall. I don't want to, incriminate him. Going by 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 on Twitter. I can leave some further details to that in the description or something. How are you doing, good sir?
I'm doing well. It is the first really warm, beautiful day that we've had, basically since last summer. And I do well when I've got a lot of vitamin D. So I'm thankful for a good day where I can open my windows.
Wonderful. Yeah, we've had a few sunny days before that, even in bloody England. But I don't know, Wisconsin's probably vaguely similar climate. I don't know, similar.
Wisconsin is mostly winter with an occasional breach of warm weather. And it has started to breach, so I'm glad for that. It snowed 5 days ago, so.
Yeah, we had a tiny bit of snow as well, like a couple of weeks ago. Weird momentary blip thing, and sort of early March, and then mid to late March, and then now we're back to sort of mid-20s Celsius. God, whenever I talk to Americans about temperature, it's always so confusing. I don't know what mid-20s is in Fahrenheit, but although also today there was a sort of mini forest fire near where I lived, so there was that thing you get where there's really weird yellow hues in the sunlight, and we had that earlier today as well. And then I went to see The Northman, which was very, very good, very epic, very violent, very primal, very, it's an entirely pre-Christian world, so every post-Christian moral sensibility is just to be damned. There's just violence, incest. Oh god, I didn't spoil it by saying that. Just all this crazy stuff, but also extremely epic as well, and very, very, very good. And it's been taken up by the far right, and of course everyone's up in arms about that. But
which means that it's probably good for you.
Well, that's the thing. They made a conscious choice to do, for example, an all-white cast. It's in this day and age with films, an all-white cast is the thing that you make an active effort to do rather than a passive one. Whereas in, 30 years ago, it would be an active thing you do a passive thing you do to have like an all-white cast, and an active thing would be to have some representation, some token. So now that's switched. So it was an active effort on their part, not a passive one, for them to have an all-white cast, and just that alone is like
It's sort of a
significant
sort of-
thing. Yeah.
sort of an anti-current thing.
Exactly. Even though the director himself has been like, "Oh God, no, I don't. I wanted to reclaim Norse mythology from the far right." Like he literally, Robert Egg, or whatever his name is, he did the Lighthouse. Yeah, he made a statement like that, which was, I mean, yeah. I mean, we can take it however we like it. So
Can't wait I can't wait to see Odin as the trans black Muslim.
Odin is surprisingly absent from this one, and obviously it would have been great if they had this setting of Odin played by Anthony Hopkins as he was in Marvel, because obviously Anthony Hopkins has a wide repertoire, and yeah, this is in a way this is kind of like the anti-Marvel, because Marvel's Thor and general Norse mythology portrayals are just extremely sanitized and extremely. Well, you eventually get people like Taika Waititi on to do all this progressifying of everything, and there's a Valkyrie who's half mixed race and bisexual, blah 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 blah.
Right. Well,
so there's also literally this Thor film coming out this year, which is like the most liberal that Thor has ever been, and he's like wearing jeans and jackets, and he's like, it's like.
What I've heard is that the fan base thinks that Thor might turn gay. That's
oh God, yeah. There was that. I mean, there's just that one little. There was that one little bit in this trailer where there's nothing actually gay about it. It's just this. I mean, the word love in the dialogue in that little scene in the trailer where it's like gay baiting, whatever the fuck it is. It's a love in the most platonic, familial sense,
Well, didn't you know that if men love each other, that means they're gay?
Yeah, we don't need to go on about it. This is for another. Yeah,
men's only options right now is to be toxically masculine or raging homosexual.
Well, sometimes those two can have an unfortunate overlap, can't they? Whether you're like, there's some examples I can't name off the top of my head, but
ragingly homosexual men who only like men are toxic masculine.
It's very sexist.
Because they're set. Yes.
Discriminatory and misogynist. Anyway, we thought we'd just leave a bit of scope for some casual chat before, but I think we need to get down to business now.
Sure.
Thank you. So yeah, we've both been we're both quite sort of recent converts to more dissident, heterodox interpretations of the West as it is now. Like I think you've had some great, very vast and quick changes over the last couple of years, haven't you? Like you thought a lot differently about things maybe 2 years ago. Or is that fair to say?
Yeah. So I guess my broad strokes political development is I was raised as kind of a normie conservative.
Yeah.
But then I went to college, and as soon as I entered the very, very progressive bubble, I got swept up in Obama fever. And so Obama was the first president that I voted for. And with an alternative like John McCain, how could you refuse, right? And then very quickly, I began to kind of see cracks in that worldview. Like it wasn't very hard for me to be like, well, this actually doesn't make much sense, or this is what he said versus what's actually happening. It doesn't make sense. And so I kind of broadened myself a little bit more to be more, I guess, libertarian. The very hated fiscal conservative, social liberal.
Sure.
And I kind of walked down the Ayn Rand route a while. I did in 2012. I did not vote for Mitt Romney, which I am actually still proud of. But I also did not vote for Obama.
Okay.
2016, I voted for Gary Johnson. I saw the choice that the system had given us between 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 and Trump was at the time I thought laughably bad, and certainly no one else in this country could possibly think that the wisdom of the electorate was giving us the best possible choice. But I remember the night of that election, I was dating a very progressive guy who was very pro-Clinton. And I remember going to bed and waking up to him doing kind of the stereotypical no and I experienced Schadenfreude at that. I was actually happy that his Satan had been elected, which is when I knew it wasn't going to work. But I was very still at the mercy of, the news isn't lying to us about everything. More often than not, they're just serving up the truth. They're just reporting the facts. Conservatives overblow the media bias, blah, blah, blah. Until Kavanaugh happened, right? Where it immediately turned into this circus where this guy is being accused by some non-entity about a situation that had allegedly happened decades and decades before, and she hadn't said anything about it until that time. None of the facts could be verified, but the media turned it into a witch hunt in which no allegation was too outlandish or terrible to be expounded upon. And then, of course, Russiagate and blah, blah, blah. And so basically that really catapulted me into not only seeing, Trumpian, I guess, national populism as more than just rubes and hicks angry at the establishment. It led me to see the outline of the establishment, the early outline of the establishment, as literally lies all the way down in one particular direction. And from there, it was only a matter of time before I guess, like, is it cringe to refer to oneself as becoming more and more based? Like, I think that's kind of cringe. But like, I guess it was like a succession of redder and redder pills.
Sure.
About the system that we live under, and that I guess that kind of brings us to today.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the word "based" has been bastardized as a self-descriptor. It's been sort of bastardized by I think you know who I'm going to mention, 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶𝗺.
Yeah, that based itself cringe now because of that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, oh god. I mean, just for helpful reference, then yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, just generally speaking, I've not really been. I can sort of sum up my development in a bit lesser time than that, because I couldn't vote until I was until like 2014, and I just was pretty uninvested in politics generally for until the age of like 19, which lots of people would think that's a bit sus. If you just or in generally, lots of people think it's a bit sus if you are someone that is a very fast convert, whereas if just a year ago you have totally different views than what you did before, particularly if you're someone that's become right wing or become like a devout Catholic or something. And I think that's a fair suspicion for some people to have. I do think people should be wary of fast not talking about you, just the general concept of fast converts, because that's something that people had to say about James Lindsay. Because James Lindsay was an extremely sort of fast. He had some very fast changes in the brutality of his anti-liberal rhetoric, and I think people that sort of culminated with him, making those recent statements about how suddenly I find the radical right just as bad as the radical left, that sort of stuff, and I think that itself is a kind of evidence for this idea of suspicion of fast converts,
Mhm.
and not that just everybody must be treated with suspicion if they. I mean, there's obviously been loads of mad stuff that's been happening recently that's just caused lots of people to have very fast changes of their viewpoints. So it's happened to a lot of people, but yeah, that's something that generally people should be wary about, or you should be sort of wary about it in yourself, because you might.
Mhm.
I sometimes think about that myself. I sometimes think I'm being overconfident in the way the new avenues of thought that I'm going into, particularly this sort of stuff that we're about to talk about whether it's Yavin or just Havel or other stuff, because it is very cynical. It's extremely cynical,
Yeah.
and it's a cynicism that means you kind of invalidate the entire world around you, just all
Mhm.
public discourse, all figures of authority. You just find yourself invalidating everything, or just thinking, all of this is just an illusion that doesn't
Yeah.
that it's completely inauthentic and completely insincere. And sometimes I do find myself stepping back and thinking, well, this is a little bit juvenile to just be so cynical and just be so.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that? Do you
Well,
sometimes get those moments? Yeah.
yeah, it's actually funny that you should say that, because I was
Mm.
reflecting that, like, um, I guess I've always had kind of a skepticism regarding the um,
Mm.
the established order, right? And I think a lot of that I can't help but have inherited from, like, I was raised Protestant, right?
Yeah.
And and I think that there is just a germ of skepticism of established hierarchies and the tapestry of knowledge creation that and meaning making and sense making that is inherited, that comes from being raised Protestant. And that, I think that, because that is part of an entirely separate conversation. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so like that I guess is kind of a theme, other than that one brief blip of um uh Obama mania that I
Yeah.
had.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even that manic about him. It's just I got swept up in
Swept
college,
swept up. Yeah,
like
definitely.
swept up in vanilla college liberalism, and it felt very, very nice to, for the first time in my life, feel like I was just going along.
Of course. Yeah.
I
Of
remember
course.
being very conscious of that, and that didn't last too long. Like, I was kind of disgusted with myself. But Michael Malice says, you're supposed to take one red pill, not the whole bottle. And I find myself really guilty of taking the whole bottle sometimes, because
Sure.
where one of the things that I'm wrestling with lately is, and this kind of gets into Yarvin, is um, this sense of impossibility of action.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not from the perspective that we can't actually do anything. Like, we have actions available to us, but Yarvin puts it great. I don't think he says it in any of the writings that we read for today, but he
Mm.
says occasionally, like when he reflects on various right-wing action in the American context. He says the only useful use of power is if it makes future action easier. And
Hmm.
and, and the way that I look at things, like, so we can look at Florida as a great example. Like, when they passed the Parental Rights Act,
Yeah.
and when in response to that, they whipped up every liberal in the country. All of the media are coming after him. Like, the discourse was basically framed by "Don't say gay," right?
Of course. Yeah.
And then add to that, uh, Disney decided to enter the fray, and um, they in return, I forget what the specific action was called, but they basically dissolved Disney's special corporate autonomous governance of their county that they're in. Um,
Most people probably had no idea even existed in the first place.
Correct, correct. I think that many
Yeah.
people are surprised that there was, in fact, one privately ruled county in the country, or
Of
you know,
course.
several. But anyway, and then in response to that, you get a bunch of the kind of the squishier conservatives are like, well, that's not American. That violates the First Amendment. Like Disney has the right to hollow out your culture and call you enemies. And that needs to be respected or whatever. And I look at all of that and I'm like, so in 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶𝗺 terms, I don't know if that's that's how he wants to be referred, but
No, that's a word I've heard before. Yeah,
in
it is a word.
𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶ianism, he would look at that and say, okay, you scored a couple of victories and you're already observing all this legion of teachers who are figuring out ways to skirt around the law, and you have also created corporate enemies, and you have alienated some of the squishier moderate right, or at least scared them. You've scared them. And so now, is action in the future for DeSantis going to be easier or more difficult? And I don't know. Like that, but I'm looking through things in that frame now, because you're not just fighting political battles. If only the battles that were being fought were political. It reminds me a lot of, what is it, Ephesians 6:12. You're not wrestling with flesh and blood. Like in Yarvin's thought, all of politics and electoral politics in particular is really just a show that's meant to absorb populist resentment and anger and dissipate it uselessly. And so that's like what I'm wrestling with these days, is like, what is the actual effective solution to this predicament we find ourselves in, and how do we act in ways that don't make future action more difficult without wallowing in inaction? Whereas, you know, I think Yarvin would say actually being detached is really how you accrue power in this situation.
Yeah. I just that what you just said reminds me of some other thing I've been thinking about recently, or just a sort of mini epiphany I had recently. So, I mean, that in terms of actions like that with Disney and the Don't Take a Bill and stuff, it's kind of what that would hopefully aim to do, I think, would be some kind of undoing of the notion of the end of history, as in history is no longer, or the political history is no longer just some constant tendency to a maximum of an asymptotic approach to perfection. Now it's just, a sort of horizontal line that just goes naturally because history goes forward, as in there are just events and there are times where some forces are more dominant and then other forces are more dominant and things rise and fall, as opposed to some idea of some constant ascent to an ever asymptotically perfected utopia. It's as if he's sort of just putting history back onto a kind of horizontal line rather than an upward vertical, a horizontal line rather than a sort of upward diagonal line. And
Sure.
it was just this recent epiphany I had about how I am terrified of the end of history. And I realized that because I was just watching a YouTube video about a history. It was the most random video of history video on YouTube. It was like the history of Georgia, I think, Georgia in the Caucasus, because I have an interest in Georgia. I think it's an interesting place in there. I thought I'd watch this video, and it's like, oh, here's what happened from this period, and then this happened, and then this happened, and nations and empires and peoples rise and fall, and trade rise and fall, and then I just thought, well, at the end, and then I looked down in the comments and I just saw people saying, "This is so interesting. This is really interesting that you just seeing these extraordinary events in this extraordinary place." And then I just thought, well, you're never going to, with the liberal vote, the notion of the end of history, where everywhere is just now a liberal democracy, where there's no fundamentally, there's no fundamental impactful conflict anymore. I just think you won't get this. You're denying people of the future the right to have a sort of casual fascination with the history of today. You're denying people that right to have that same, just wondrous, inspirational fascination with history as a horizontal trajectory.
Yeah.
And I just suddenly realized I'm terrified of this. I don't want the end of history. And fundamentally, you can't end history because fundamentally life goes on, time moves on. But you can't stop time. Time moves on, and there's always going to be a new conflict. You know, we thought we'd reached the end of history at the end of the 19th century. You know, we thought we'd reach peak, and then you had the First World War, and then at the end of the Cold War, we were like, okay, this time, and then of course you
Yeah.
had everything
And
else.
do
And
you
so I'm terrified of the end of history. You know, I'm terrified, and that then maybe that relates to how just the mere fact that DeSantis is doing something different, as in it's dissenting against the people that want an end of history. They want a asymptotically greater utopia.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it feels like just this competition of utopianisms, right? So,
Mm,
like, if communism had won, communists would have declared the end of history, right? Like,
of course, yeah. Well, yeah, same
and
basic thing. I mean,
and
it's there are different there is the one that's genuinely the the old young Hegelian types, which are the ones
Mhm.
that kind of which lend themselves to communism, and then there are the more Whiggish ones, as they're called, which
Yeah,
are a bit
yeah.
different. Yeah. Sorry,
But
Karen.
but it all ultimately boils down to this zealous seeking after the kingdom of God on earth, right? I think
Exactly. Yes.
Jonathan Haidt just published a piece, I think in the Atlantic. It's one that I've got bookmarked. I haven't really read it in depth yet, but at least the framing was interesting, where he recounts the Tower of Babel, right? And it seems like
Mm,
that all human endeavors seem to be on the macro scale the establishment of cultural hegemony across about everything, right? A tower that unites us all and brings us to heaven. And the consequence of hegemony, I think, is decadence, right? Like once you
mm,
have your total order, there is an inherent um, entropy to it. I say this a lot, that
a
Rome seemed,
paradox.
yeah, there's the paradox of hegemony, is decadence. I think you see this in that, I don't know who coined this cycle, but hard times lead to strong men lead to good times,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and good times lead to weak men, which is maybe where we're at right now. Weak men leading, but uh, with hegemony comes decadence. And I always like to point out that Rome seemed strongest when it had its Carthage, right?
Mm,
Basically, as soon as Carthage was destroyed, delenda est, um, uh, the Roman ruling class became especially awful. The conflicts that the Romans had internally became greater and greater and greater, until it was basically ripe for Caesar to sweep it all away, in his
mm.
way he did. And so I think that you're seeing a shattering of the illusion of unipolarity in a lot of different ways right now, right? Speak of hegemony, right? There was this kind of quote unquote liberal consensus, for years and years and years, and now Trump and then now DeSantis seem to be shattering that. You have Russia, China, and India forming kind of their own axis, and Russia is
Mm.
very deliberately pursuing multipolarity. Uh, you have scholars on the ascent, despite the to put it in Yarvin's terms, despite the cathedral's distaste for him. John Mearsheimer has been a very prescient voice, regarding um, Ukraine and the things that led to the quote unquote military action, or the special operation. Um, and so I think that what we're seeing is, uh, um, after 30 years of a distinctive American story, and not even just American story. It was a slice of the American ruling class that was actually the ruling class, the actual oligarchs, telling a story about the world that is starting to fracture, both in the sense that there is action directly against it, both domestically and internationally, and it's starting to fracture in terms of legitimacy. Like, I think that there's a growing sense that, at least among most people, that we're all just being bullshitted.
Exactly.
And those two things taken together, I think, are going to make this regime that that is variously called the American global, or the global American empire, or globo-homo, or everything that is under the newest iteration of the pride flag. It's going to make it increasingly dangerous. Maybe not in terms of military danger, but I mean, we seem content to do everything in our power to destabilize the global supply chain. And I think, did you ever see the movie 300 or read the graphic?
No, I didn't. No, sorry.
So there's this great scene where Leonidas, like, it's this hopeless, it's the 300 Spartans and the Persians under Xerxes, and it's toward the end, like, the Spartans are being slaughtered, and Leonidas makes the point. He's like, I don't have to kill you. I just have to show you that you can be wounded. And he hurls a spear, and it doesn't kill Xerxes, but it does cut his face, showing that he's not a god. And so, Yarvin writing, in 2020, says that this change is not going to come in the next decade. It's going to take years and years and years. But I think we're starting to see what we call the cathedral. Not only is it very apparent that it exists and that it operates in a specific set of ways, but it's also becoming increasingly illegitimate in people's brains.
I don't know whether it's just people like us being sort of chronologically chauvinist, where we say, oh, now is finally the time where more people are starting to be more scrutinizing, or whether that's just because maybe loads of people have said that at loads of different points since the end of the Second World War thing. Maybe loads of people have said that. Maybe loads of people have gathered around, and there's been like some hype in the media about criticizing the UN or something. I don't know. Maybe that has happened lots of times. The main thing that would be evidence for that there is something unprecedented happening at the moment is just social media is this incredible thing that is unprecedented itself and has. I mean, I certainly think social media has had been part of the main reason why there was this great awakening, as it was in this massive increase in scrutiny of racism and sexism and transphobia that started to occur, like, sort of late 2015 was when it sort of started to occur. I don't know if it was just Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump announcing his presidential candidacy. That first thing was like the first stage of things, but I don't know whether it's just that or whether it is just this eventual consequence of social media being adopted in this way. It's hard to tell, but I do think there is something in social media being this particular driving force behind it, because I mean, it is like an art form, and it is it has been a spreader of disinformation, quote unquote, in in a way, obviously, that it has also been used to just spread further propaganda that the traditional media used to spread. So I do think there is something to be said about social media being this unprecedented force, more so than just us being chauvinistic about the present being this great pinnacle, this great reckoning moment, which it might end up not being at all. But yeah.
I guess my take on that is that social media has become, I don't know, the way that I look at it is it's an agent of chaos.
Exactly,
It's
exactly.
hard to tell how it will affect anything in any predictable way, right? Because on the one hand, like you said, I think it has contributed significantly to the Great Awakening, allowing bad ideas to be amplified and spread virulently. Um, and people seem to it seems to accommodate auto swarm behavior.
Well,
Um,
it's like a massive surveillance system. You know,
right.
you can have someone post a video of just some, like, I don't know, someone saying something in a class that's mean, and goes everywhere in the whole world in a second. Like,
Right.
and
Right.
not every time that, like, people like to just think that happens all the time, but occasionally that can happen. And
But it is
yeah.
enough of a risk, right? That I think that
Mm,
it's being factored more and more into people's general risk assessment about how they
mm.
behave when when they show their face and whatever. But it's appropriate to this conversation right now. But the other thing is that um, it, it it's hard to control, right?
Of course, yeah.
I think that we have all opted ourselves into a sort of hyper reality uh,
Yes.
that has allowed for information warfare like we have never seen before. I mean, World War I was in big part an information war. I've been sort of reading this great book called Manipulating the Masses, and it's a study of the Wilsonian
Hmm.
pro- of propagandizing um, America into World War I.
Of course, yeah.
And
No,
how yeah, and
I
how a lot
just
of those
quickly.
tentacles.
Sorry,
Yeah, well,
Karen.
it's basically
Karen.
about how a lot of those tentacles have continued well beyond the scope of any of the official agencies that were founded to start it, right? And it
Mm,
also created a class of uh, professional journalists, credentialed journalists, official journalists who began to see themselves as uh, social engineers.
mm.
And I'm sure like that fused with kind of this social progressivism that we need to change the world and well the way to
Mm.
change the world is to shape the world that people think exists and
Sure.
for
Uh,
action.
there was certainly fertile ground for that
Mhm.
predated Wilson by a number of decades. I mean, it had been set in motion in the late 19th century, hadn't it?
Yeah.
My sort of current working thesis of that is that I what I was going to say when you mentioned Wilson was I've been recently reading this paper. I need to finish it, go, but it's this paper about Wilson, and because it is actually extremely surprising what, based on the sort of man he was in his early career and his upbringing and everything, that he would go on to be kind of the instigator of institution, the red stamp on institutional political progressivism in America. Um, Given that he himself was this, I think he was a Calvinist, and he had this strongly bourgeois uh, worldview before his more official political career. He low government intervention and all that jazz, and this paper is just trying to kind of understand why and how. And I should have read the whole thing, but the paper the thing is that the paper says there is this kind of there was a Hegelian influence on him that sort of found its way in there when at some point, and it was part of some I found that paper when I was just doing some general research about um, how did progressivism in America come, and because it didn't I don't think there's some inbuilt mechanism, there's some there's some element of the original foundation of the United States, 13 colonies, that includes progressivism that they were naive about. I don't think that's true. I don't think all this bad stuff is completely inbuilt into like the founding fathers. Some of them had some bad ideas, but I don't think that's true. I think it was something that came was introduced a bit later on. I have this general working thesis at the moment based on so I've read about, you know, a more explicit Hegelian influence coming into America in the middle of the 19th century into universities, and then that eventually kind of bled into everything else,
Mhm.
and might reach the seat of government in time for the First World War, and that's the best way for me to describe just my worldview. If people want is I just say I'm an anti-progressive, but using the word progressive in the most general sense, whether that's all the stuff that because it's useful for both describing all the stuff that happens today with gender and sexuality, blah blah, blah in the political way, social political way, and also just all these things that took place in the same time as the First World War and before, and Wilson and as you say, the professional journalism and the Federal Reserve and in England especially it was very pronounced. That's the sort of main working thesis I have at the moment is being an anti-progressive because it's not it does mean something specific. It does mean something. It's not just this idea of things getting better. It does mean something very specific about. I mean, it's German it's historicism. Like at the end of the day, it is the Germans. No, I'm not just going to blame that. It's historicism basically, and it has its roots in young Hegelianism. Because
Yeah.
in my opinion, which some people might question at the moment, is my main working thesis. I don't know if you thought about that much. As in, is this all just young Hegelianism in the most general sense, whether that's Marxism or all the other things that were not Marxist but have a Hegelian influence on them?
So when it comes to Hegel, I am actually not super well versed in his work. I mean, I know that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not an expert either, and it's just a kind of. I admit it's a working theory I have at the moment.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But I think that the way that I would think about things is that a lot of this is inbuilt into liberalism as such.
Yeah.
And so liberalism, and John Mearsheimer talks about this a lot. To bring in, I mentioned it before. He talks about liberalism as universalism. Like,
Yeah.
it makes statements about all people everywhere.
Yeah.
Which is actually something that it inherited from Christianity.
Of course. Yeah.
But no Jews, no Gentiles, right? And the idea behind universalism is that this set of beliefs and principles holds true for all people everywhere at all times. And the United States has used that as a justification for interventionism, right? Now, once upon a time, I think that the founders and their early generation, while not by no means perfect, there is still a strong sense of restraint.
Sure.
In terms of what sort of interventions were justified and which ones weren't.
Oh
And
yeah, no, yeah. There is some fantastic
Yeah.
quotations from George Washington on
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
And Jefferson, but even so, like, there is still that impulse early on, and I
Sure.
think one of and this is maybe one of the more cancelable things that we might talk about, but right now it's very, very fashionable to talk about how the racial reckoning of the United States is going on because we haven't kept our promise perfectly, right? I think that this is what Martin Luther King Jr. And Frederick Douglass and that line of thinking was that, well, you're not, like, you have this written out in your Declaration of Independence and your Constitution, and you're not keeping that promise perfectly. And that was a fair point, right? I am, I think, innately a fairly liberal person in that sense. And it becomes a justification for a globalizing drive, right?
Sure.
That because my worldview applies to all people everywhere, and I believe it to be the true, the good, the beautiful, the just, why shouldn't it justify any action, right?
Sure.
Yarvin talks about this toward the end of the descriptive constitution, about
Mm.
the cathedral. If it weren't political, it could actually be a very good and powerful thing, for good. But because it's political, power has the tendency to corrupt and hijack everything, so that it becomes only interested in more power. And so, like, the two examples of power bias that he uses are Rawlsian social justice and consequentialist ethics, which Yarvin describes as literally the ethics of Lucifer.
Yeah. No,
That's what
I
makes
remember
sense,
that. Yeah.
right? So universalism says this set of beliefs applies to all people everywhere. This set of beliefs is true and good. Therefore, why shouldn't we intervene to assert our will over there? No matter what the consequences are, right? Because it doesn't matter if what we want to do is impossible. At least we did something. We
Of
had
course.
an impact is always sexy, no matter whether or not it's effective. In a good.
Sure. My main, not was a response, my main instinctual take on all that, the idea of liberalism as a totalizing force, a universalizing force. I am someone in the current state of semi naivety that I have is inclined to believe that it's difficult. There are some significant strands of liberalism that are genuinely more respectful of the idea of particularity, of rejecting the idea of universal principles on temporal affairs, whether that's economic affairs or governmental, just structures of government. And I truly believe that there is still at the moment. I might I might be read some perspective that totally knocks us out of the whack, but I do think there is something that can be called liberal that sidesteps this totalizing way of thinking, which I think leads into a sort of discussion about Kant, because obviously Yarvin talks about Kant quite a lot, and I read some stuff recently which kind of about Kantian legal theory and Kantian ethics. It was a sort of brief summary of it, but and contrast that with Aristotelian understandings of ethics, and also the English liberal tradition, which is legitimately sort of distinct from the German one that Kant lived amongst. And Kant, of course, also went on to influence Hegel and all that. But I read this perspective on Kant, where Kant is kind of this particular definitive thinker on the idea of, in order to have the greatest amount of liberal virtue in the most number of people, you have to have some upper authority that creates generalizing circumstances from their own perspective that are the best circumstances for all people to have the most amount of freedom, where they're not infringing on the freedom of another individual, but all the possibilities of infringement are just thought up a priori. And and this is distinct from the idea of particularity, the idea of legality and ethics, and just which extends to politics in general, as an inexact science where what are the best rules and jurisdictions are those that are revealed a posteriori, as in you have to let people live before you can truly know what the best rules are. And of course the rules should be generally mutable. And not mutable in the sense that they are always approaching some asymptotically great utopian sense, but just mutable in that they just change with circumstances. So with temporary circumstances, they might go one way and come back again. And I kind of summarized that badly, but I thought it'd be useful to bring this to Kant because I'm in a particular position now where I see Kant as a kind of major architect in this notion of universalist liberalism. I mean, there's certainly a more Kantian German, or maybe even just Lutheran, German Lutheran type liberalism influence on things like the United Nations, or as in people recognize that kind of liberalism as what has formed the United Nations, or these other type of organizations like it, and so yeah, it's the Germans basically. It's the Germans.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this too. Like when I think about restraint and particularity, I think, I guess where my brain goes is there any alternative to universalism? Not in the sense, not in this, like, I think that right now we have our universalism, but I don't, like, I think it's a very natural human thing for people to want to be on top and to dominate others, and for a culture to want to grow, right? In some, I guess, some cultural Darwinian way, right?
There'll be plenty of people that will be the most insincere, selfish people themselves, but can see this universalism, liberal religion, and think, I'll get on with this, and then I can just use this to take over the world.
Sure.
And
I think the situation that we find ourselves in, however, is what I guess that I don't want to speak for the neo-reactionaries as a whole necessarily, because I'm still learning kind of what their corpus of thought is, but there's a few big thinkers that I have had enough exposure to where I can say that, like, the situation we find ourselves in right now is that with the growth of the quote unquote liberal democratic state, the promise of liberalism was a liberation of people from arbitrary authority, and oppression of the outmoded superstitions and traditions of the past, blah blah blah. And what has happened is we now have the largest state and most powerful state the world's
exactly.
And so like one thinker that helps to analyze that, who the neo-reactionaries have sort of claimed, although he would have characterized himself as a liberal, was Bertrand de Juvenel, who was a French theorist who he wrote during like the Second World War, and some of his works are he's a tough read. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
Some of his works that are worth reading are on sovereignty and on power, and he started out with that question, like how is it that under liberal democracy we now have the largest states the world has ever seen, and the most powerful states, and they just seem to keep on getting more and more powerful. And his broad argument is that we formalized power in a way that power doesn't actually work, right? We wrote down these constitutions that don't actually hold power accountable. And he would say is that power, like the structure of power, is high plus low versus middle. The central power, the central authority partners itself or allies itself with the margin to destabilize intermediary power. And you can see this again and again, example after example. I think my favorite example domestically is anything to do with civil rights legislation. So the central federal, and you're seeing this right now actually with, to bring it back to DeSantis, you're seeing this happening with the parental rights in education bill. The White House is is threatening that they're going to bring civil rights lawsuits against the state, because what they're arguing is that only the central power has the authority and the power to protect the quote unquote civil rights of individuals, and
Sure.
the intermediary authority is oppressing those individuals. Therefore, we must beat back that intermediary. What that means is over the past 100, 150, 200, 250 years, we have created a scenario in which the quote unquote will of the people is oracled by a strong central government that has smashed into irrelevance any of the intermediary powers that it used to face. So, as examples of that, the church used to compete with monarchs for power and territory, basically. It no longer does. In the American context, states used to have significant, meaningful power, whereas now it is very clear that the federal government holds the top spot in most, if not all, situations, and actually to the point where after that Florida federal judge tossed out mask mandates for air travel, you saw people tweeting nonsense like the authority of the federal government is under attack, right?
God.
I believe that my commentary on that was that progressivism is just a euphemism for worship of the central totalizing state.
Sure.
I think that to tie a bow on that, like 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 and his analysis of competing power structures is a really insightful way to see how central power has been using, quote unquote, the oppressed people, right? We're going to take the oppressed people under our protection as a way to cudgel away any competition and distribution of that central power.
Sure.
He also analyzes it in terms of a quote unquote arms race. So a great example that he uses is as soon as France instituted the levée en masse, its neighboring countries had to, because all of a sudden every civilian was a possible soldier, whereas the surrounding states really only had professional small militaries. So you have this arms race between states that has just been escalating and escalating and escalating.
Of course.
And so 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 is a very, very good thinker, or at least a very challenging thinker.
There's lots of different different wordings of this same paradoxical dilemma that are all sort of equally interesting, because they're all coming from these different perspectives, coming up with the same thesis. I mean, then it's nice to kind of put them together and sort of have them sharpen each other. But this general idea of individual liberation is causing despotic hell, and it's taken me a long. I've always had a kind of. I mean, I similar to you, I was a kind of normie, conservative, libertarian type person around. I mean, my main sort of awakening was with Brexit and thinking, oh, hang on, maybe this politics thing is worth caring about. And then, I was just kind of normie, conservative, libertarian, just admirer of Margaret Thatcher. I still admire Margaret Thatcher, but just in a different way, in a more kind of nuanced way. But I've finally come round to why it's a problem to say that the individual is a socio-political sovereign, or should be seen as such. And I mean, I read another piece on the Mises Institute, which is something about it's called The Cost of the Enlightenment, which is it's a great piece, and it's one of those particular pieces on Mises that gets shared a lot. And it basically talks about all these mitigating tyranny, these institutions that mitigate tyranny that are, social. So the church or the localized, voluntary, unofficial. I mean, unofficial in the sense that they're not sort of administrated by the state. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be this distinction of official and unofficial, because what makes things official is just them being administered by some, the way that government is now. But anyway, mostly that's the church, or it could otherwise be just local societies for some special interest, or schools, customary community-based civil institutions that were mitigating tyranny. And with COVID, it's been a particular demonstration of how when we are all treated as individuals by the state, because all these other mitigating institutions, like the churches, like I don't know, from my perspective, musical performance groups. It's something I do. All this stuff was subordinate to the COVID rules and the state and everything. And the underlying motivations for the COVID rules was fundamentally saving the individual, or making the individual sovereignty as best as it possibly could, relative to everyone else's. It was about saving the individual. That's fundamentally what all the COVID lockdowns were about. It was about the sovereignty of the individual.
Yeah, and a really specific example of this right now that's going on is why did the parental rights bill have to be passed? Well, in part it had to be passed because parents were delegating some of their sovereignty over their children to employees of the state.
Exactly. I mean, it just applies to public schools, isn't it? Yeah.
Right, and those teachers. And many teachers, and I think that this has been going on a lot longer than people realize, in a lot wider array of things than people realize, those teachers were taking it upon themselves to mold students into a worldview that the teachers believe to be good, true, and beautiful, without parental knowledge or consent. Right? The parents are the intermediary power. The teachers believe themselves to be liberators. Okay. Now, this is not a condemnation of that process as such, because I think it's foolish for people to believe that institutions can be neutral, or that education can be non-indoctrination. Like I think that is actually a trap.
Value free.
Value free. Like this is another neo-reactionary, or an icon that neo-reactionaries point to is the thinker Carl Schmitt, who he's got a couple of different works and big ideas. One of those works is The Tyranny of Values. Like, you don't have a choice but to have values, and to go in kind of the intellectual dark web area. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, that like you don't have a choice but to have values. Like, human beings need a moral frame to even interact with the world. Value-free or indoctrination-free education, like people who say, oh, we can have government and institutions that are values neutral, worldview neutral, are themselves, they've self-neutered them, any of their political energy, because they believe that neutrality is possible, and I don't think it is. But to bring it back to your point you're making, like the indoctrination, to as a lack of a better word, into values that utopian educators are using in schools, and parents are the barrier to that. Now, the process that you're talking about, where liberation of the individual is the highest good, Patrick Deneen, who is I believe he's a scholar at Notre Dame here in the States. He wrote a book called,
I've heard of him. I can't remember where I did from. Yeah, but
he wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's a good introduction to a lot of these ideas. And he makes the point really well, I think, that liberalism is great when you have a cultural core that holds character ethics to be important, right? Like you don't need outer
Sure.
law, have inner law.
This kind of relates to this just something we were talked about once on like a private chat, right? Where I was talking about we were talking about democracy, and I talked about democracy having virtues when it's blood and soil democracy, as in when it is democracy, and this democracy could be interchangeable with liberalism here, when it's a liberalism that has come from the actual, I mean, fundamentally liberalism is religious. Also, it's political. It it lends itself to like Greek philosophy and stuff. But when that liberalism is in place amongst people that have actually have themselves facilitated its development, as in it hasn't been exported in this late way to somewhere else. So that's where liberalism works best. I mean, liberalism, the reason why the Industrial Revolution happened and why free markets are so great is mostly because of trust. And not all societies by default have high trust. And there was a particular religious disposition to England and America where there was this very strongly disciplined personal trust that people had, and that facilitated great economic growth. So yeah, when it's blood and soil liberalism, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the ethics that make it possible for individual rights as an institution, as a cultural norm, like that set of ethics has been hollowed out. And
exactly, yeah.
What Moldbug would describe, old school 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 would have described as antinomianism, anti-order, right? And the way that I think of things now is not altogether metaphorically this a bond between the devil and humans, right? Like did God really say that? Right? Like any tradition,
Sure.
any tradition, any ethic, any rule, any commandment, did God really say that? Or is he just worried that you're going to be free and won't need him anymore, right? And you see that again and again and again and again, right? In these various revolutions. I think that the clearest example maybe the past 70 years was the sexual revolution, where I mean, basically we're dealing with the long fallout of that, where you can have sex with everybody and build meaningful relationships with none.
Well, free love, man.
Free love, man.
Well, free love is itself, a liberation of the individual, isn't it?
Right, and a liberation of the individual from any commitment whatsoever, right?
From any custom, exactly.
Any custom, but even any commitment, right? Like, I think our generation is particularly vulnerable to this, where it's like, oh, just go with the flow, don't overthink, you don't need labels on things, where that wreaks havoc on people's mental health.
I will say this one thing that something I spoke about with something I'd noticed even while I was a bit more of a normie, something I noticed is that in terms of sex and culture in the West, and this is vaguely similar for America and Britain, there is still some underlying fundamental way that people see sexual infidelity as bad. Like people see cheating in the most general sense, whether it's an actual marriage where there's an affair, or whether it's just two people who are like seeing each other and then one of them might be texting someone else. There's still some underlying commitment to the idea that there's something wrong about that. For some reason, we've still clung on to that, and it's quite interesting to sort of take a step back and realize, despite how much we are all, told to just go with the flow and everything, we still cling on to that. Like it's funny.
I'd have to ask though, who still clings on to that? because
Sure, yeah,
like
it's
because amongst the what I would call today's cultural elite, open relationships are fashionable, right?
of course, yeah. No,
So
it's a sort of privilege to
yeah, right,
be in that position. Yeah.
right, and I think that I called it the straight-laced white woman to radical feminist in a poly relationship pipeline is TikTok, right? Like it's like I know multiple people now who they were in women in particular were in monogamous relationships with men, and as soon as they got into TikTok, and this it's funny how often I hear this story. They got onto TikTok, and it wasn't very long before they were starting to find videos of like women talking about how they realized later in life that they were into other women, and they started to explore. They divorced their husbands and became lesbians, blah blah. Like like I have actual people in my life who have followed that path and are actually now in what they call polycules, where it's polyamorous relationships, and you know, I'm not gonna be the person who's like, we need to make anything like that illegal, right? And and I think that ideas like that held by fashionable elites have a way of trickling into the broader culture.
Sure. I mean,
Sometimes not even
'cause
trickle, right?
I've never used TikTok ever, so
I think that's wise.
but um, I mean, that sort of thing, I imagine, has been around since the political lesbians became this thing, which was in the 1970s. And women would be all these impressionable ideas that were on campuses, and this, I mean, that was when the first women's studies things uh, came about in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, I mean, the idea that TikTok, which is very recent, is this new this new driving force for that sort of thing is pretty
But it does come back to our discussion about social media generally, right? Like,
Sure, yeah.
did you ever read Rene Girard? He has this idea of mimetic desire, and what I think that social media has done has made it possible for ideas to be amplified to everyone all at once extremely quickly,
Exactly, yeah,
which we've never had as a species. Like I think up until TV, uh, it was not possible to have
hyper socialization is
right,
a
right,
word that is an unofficial
right,
term for this sort of thing. Yeah.
right. And you know, I think one of the I forget who wrote it. It might have been oh, I'm not gonna be able to think of his name now. Somebody wrote a good so Aristotle had his idea of telos, and everything is growing towards something. And in at least the human situation, we can either choose what our telos is, we can point ourselves at something, or we will be pointed towards something.
Sure.
And so the question is, what does the internet want? Right? Like what is it evolving blindly toward, and how is it dragging us along in that process?
I think there's definitely something in TikTok being, a video-based platform, and stuff like Twitter being less likely for a pipeline for women from going to being married to. But there'll be something about videos themselves are more, they're more impactful, and on TikTok, obviously, lots of people tend to talk quite fast, don't they? Try to like say a million points in one go, and I think that there's something innate in that makes it more impressionable. So yeah, that would be where I'd say Twitter is a force for good in terms of social media being more impactful in waking people up from the regime or whatever, and then TikTok being one that's more, because it's videos are more able to kind of bring them back in line with the way that the regime wants them to be. So yeah,
Mhm.
there's different types of social media. There are different forces for good and evil, or whether they're just a sort of catalyst for speeding up the process in both ways, speeding up the process of, you know, adhering to the regime or disconnecting from the regime, just speeding up the process in both ways, but without changing the equilibrium point, sort of thing. Yeah, I'd say TikTok is more socializing towards the regime, and Twitter would be less so, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, and it may like have, I guess, so Yarvin talks about how the kind of the in his descriptive constitution of the contemporary system, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
he's building on 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶, right? He references
yes, he does.
a
Yeah.
lot. And in this descriptive constitution, the cathedral is at the top and it guides everything else. And the cathedral consists of a lot of different things. The brain he would characterize as academia, the voice is our media, the conversation is the ideas that the cultural elites have with each other based on what the voice has told them. And the brain and the voice and all of them are dreaming the same dream. He calls our regime a materialist clerical oligarchy.
Yes. No. Yeah.
Which
His ideas of clericalism, which is clericalism not in the in the religious sense, in the more kind of stale academic sense,
yeah,
is very
but
compelling. Yeah.
it's like a secular, I guess the juicy term
Mm.
that I would use for it is secular theocracy or atheocracy.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
And so the
yeah.
reason that I asked about that is it's like, or the reason that I brought it up is like, yeah, the brain or academia needs the voice to communicate ideas, but here's what I wondered. Has the brain and the voice, I feel like I'm talking about the hand of Sauron here, but like with innovations like Twitter and TikTok, which allow for the mass dissemination of ideas from anyone to anyone,
Mm.
have we entered kind of uncharted territory in terms of the auto system, like 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 talks about, right? Where the ideology, it's not even people anymore. It's the ideology spreads itself rapidly, iterates itself rapidly, spreads that iteration, evolves, etc., like through these media, no longer needing to be mediated by people in prestigious positions. Does that question make
So
sense? That idea of a series of Luciferian bargains,
definitely.
antinomianism, right? Like, I think that the regime that we have,
Yeah.
old school Moldbug, he's got this quote that Cthulhu swims slowly but always swims left, right? And he's trying to parse out how is it that the left or the culture always moves leftward? Like there is no such thing as a conservative victory such that the culture starts to move rightward and keeps on moving further and further right? Like that's almost boggles the mind thinking about a world in which that would happen. And his broad stroke argument is that the left represents people who are willing to make people who are interested in seeking power and are willing to break nomos in order to do it, break order, shortcuts.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. Yeah.
And the reason that we haven't had total collapse yet is because we keep on having technological innovation and advancement that makes it possible for us to take bigger and bigger shortcuts.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's at a certain point, like we devour ourselves from the inside. Like at a certain point, you can't shortcut anymore. And so, like, I'm not sure how to ask this, but I think maybe where I'm getting at is like if the cathedral continues to expand power and the culture drifts left because of all of these shortcuts and every every social norm is an opportunity for subversion, which in our context is an opportunity for power because people can subvert in order to get power. We're picking on TikTok here, but is TikTok representative of the ultimate auto antinomian system in which
do you mean it's sort of the highest interference from the regime into the privacy of ourselves, as in just one step short of literally, programming thoughts into our brains?
Yeah, I would say
Is it the closest to that?
Yeah,
Is that what you mean?
I would say so.
I'd,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean,
it's like could you engineer a better system to automate degeneration? Right?
Oh God, I don't know why I'm laughing, but it's kind of true. Oh God, I always say, nothing shocks me anymore, but then something comes along that shocks me, and, it wouldn't shock me. I'd say nothing shocks me more if this is the worst stage, we TikTok being the most interfering into,
Yeah.
I'd say there is, it would be, it's likely that we are at the peak. I mean, the the maybe even an indication of how we are at the peak is how just the mere fact that there does tend to genuinely be more scrutiny of the regime than there's ever been before, because we've reached this peak, and it's reached this. There's no further it can go to intrude into, to be as intrusively socializing. There's no further way it can go. I mean, yet, but
Well, I mean, I wonder yet, like what is the
well, it's
like,
not.
do we just
It is.
plug ourselves directly into the matrix, right?
I mean, I'm sort of reminded of North Korea, in that specifically, or in talking about North Korea, specifically the way that every flat, supposedly, I mean, there's not, maybe don't take my exact word for it, but every single flat in every single home in North Korea has a radio in it which you cannot turn off, that sings praises of, the great leader and what's going on, blah blah blah. I guess now at this point we would sort of compare that to what we have now, because at the end of the day we do have the choice to just not get TikTok, and we do
Right.
have the power to do that, and we're not North we're not North Korea. Do you think North Korea qualifies as a traditional dictatorship in the way that Havel put it? Remember?
I don't
Or
know.
am I sort of going down an unfortunate tangent here?
That is a good question. I don't know. I think of
Sure.
North Korea is geographically constrained and isolated, but they I forget exactly how Havel describes the USSR, but like it's top to bottom, like people are programmed in basic. It's like a theocracy with the Kim dynasty.
It's not actually. It's not very traditional at all. No,
Oh,
actually,
yeah.
it's not.
So,
No, it's of course it's not. No, of course not.
and yeah, so
it's. I guess that's an interesting. I guess that's an interesting way of comparing it, or an interesting case study to possibly contrast it, because as in this, having this radio that you're not allowed to turn off, as opposed to in the West we have far more sophisticated technology. Everyone has smartphones. I'm assuming fewer people have smartphones in North Korea. Fewer people have TikTok, but nevertheless,
we've created kind of a Huxleyan radio that we don't want to turn off.
Sure, exactly. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like that's
because we have that ability. There's obviously social pressures in place for us to not, or our own gratification. I mean, to not want to turn it off, of course. Yeah.
Well, and all of this kind of like, so this is going to veer kind of into maybe unnecessary or unwanted territory for you, but like so you're a religious fellow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
So,
dabble. No, I
uh,
am. Yeah.
I mean, I'm as religious as somebody who can be, given the bell of modernity can't be unrung, right? Like
Of
that's
course,
how.
of course. No,
And
yeah,
but
I get what you're saying. Yeah.
but I do find myself thinking about, the days that we find ourselves in through the lens of Revelation, right? And like, we've had, God, three of the four horsemen, right? Of war and disease and famine. I think famine is on its way. Right. Who is it? I saw a tweet today. It's been 18 months since Build Back Better turned into global food shortages. Um, and I think that, I don't have the verse or the book open right in front of me, but like there's basically this feeling that like people will opt into Antichrist, right? And like they'll see Antichrist as a this worldly messianic figure. Like, here's all of this chaos. I'm here to make things better. I'm here to save you.
In
Um,
terms of that, I think that's I think that has been set in motion decades before now. Like I mean, one example is someone I talk about a lot, I think about a lot, is John Maynard Keynes.
Mm.
I mean, the Keynesian revolution is now 100 years old, and Keynes is probably the most singly influential person in the whole world, particularly in the realm of economy and finance of the 20th century. He's a humongous figure, humongously influential figure, and recently I've been reading about the awful sort of person he was, but the most recent thing was he literally wrote the words in an advisory document to the government around the time that his policies were getting reception. My policies are stones into bread, and I'm assuming it's not a coincidence that stones into bread was the idea of Mr. 𝗥𝗲𝗴𝗶 himself.
yeah.
He was tempting Jesus in the desert. So like, so if this underlying Luciferian notion could, I mean, I think that is, even Keynes or no Keynes, there is something definitely demonic about finance in the world today. Very demonic. Mostly through the distrust and dishonesty that nominal value has now. This huge disconnect between nominal and de facto value that units of currency have. But for all sorts of reasons, finance is so demonic today. But I just seeing things like that, these little things like Keynes literally advocating for stones into bread, is just how I would find this all set in motion decades before now, rather than some recent thing.
Yeah.
Or that would be why that's not a reason to be chauvinistic about the present as being some prescient moment where things are going wrong. It's like no, just look at all this other stuff that was 100 years ago.
Yeah. That's crazy. I had no idea. But I mean, yeah. I mean, so much of the world is just fake. And if it's not fake passively, it's just an outright lie, right?
Yeah.
And I think as we're approaching what is probably going to be a pretty significant recession in the United States, if not global,
Yeah, man.
that the bill for a lot of that IOU is coming due very rapidly.
It's already started, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
So it's hard. I know that Yarvin, in what we read for this conversation, he's pretty pessimistic about
Yeah.
your term. But I don't know. Like, if things really hit the fan, I don't know if a regime that's basically fake all the way down is going to be able to last that. I just, yeah,
But it survived before.
it's
That's
true.
or in it might it's not unreasonable to say something like to just immediately retort. It's done this before. There
Yeah.
was the first Great Depression and the financial crisis less so because that was genuinely something that was more kind of hidden in the run up to it, and whereas this has just been far more overt from fucking
Yeah.
WEF and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's it's very tough to not be cynical, and we
Right.
do have to laugh a little bit. Yeah, I do genuinely believe that there is some sort of turning point in terms of realization, which is spurred on by the more kind of purely verbal aspect of realms of social media, or like Twitter, or maybe less so Facebook, I suppose. But I do genuinely believe there is something that it's possibly in the works. I do. There are just these little things here and there that are strange, like this Florida thing is pretty unprecedented. This assertion of local autonomy in a way. I mean, it's not really being framed like that so much, even from its own praises. Not many people are praising Florida in a way that of the idea that Florida is this autonomous region. They're just praising it just for the things it's doing.
Yeah.
And then you have little things like that. The president of El Salvador, which is I don't know if it's that significant, maybe, but it's certainly weird. It's quite a weird thing that's not really happened very much in a country like El Salvador. Like all this time, countries like El Salvador have just been client states of the IMF basically, and there's this one strange little thing where they're just saying no. We reject the IMF. We're going to actually try and do something that might help us because we've been trying all this IMF shit and it's just made everything worse for everybody that it touches. Maybe just maybe we might try something without your help. Just these little things that are strange and possibly unprecedented. I don't know.
Well, I
just
guess my question there is like how long before how long before the color revolution?
Oh god, yeah. What I like that the first time I thought that, like, how long till the CIA coup, was when there was this one tweet from the president. I can't remember his name. Where he was saying it was just like a sort of video advert for the idea of eat healthily, go for runs to protect yourself against COVID-19, do healthy things, do a healthy lifestyle. It's like that was the one. It was like, when is his CIA coup coming? Because
Yeah.
he's not talking about vaccines. He's not talking. That was the one. And just quickly, things like Brexit. Since Brexit happened, I have become a little bit more cynical about it as more of a blip than some sort of full-on, revolution, because, there's really bad things happening in Britain right now, really bad things that, have overshadowed all the gratification I got from Brexit. But at the end of you do have to take a step back and sometimes think that's actually really weird that actually happened. Like, but no one's ever left that before. No one's ever left any of these sorts of unions of nations before. There have certainly been nations that have refused to join, but refusing to join is different from outright leaving.
Right.
It's different. So it is strange, and I find that hard to just be so cynical about that when you do have things like that happening. I do find it hard to not see those things as strange or significant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I think there's a lot I think there's a lot to be said about when part of detachment means accepting the situation as it is, right?
Mm.
And you know, I think there's a lot to be said about, like, don't be black-pilled. Yeah, right.
Well,
Like, 'cause
well,
like that's a
'cause
strong sense that I have to fight back against.
of course,
Yeah.
for anybody as a person, you at the end of the day, you have to live your life. You have to
Mhm.
try and live a good life, and it's impossible for you to maintain a state of cynicism. I mean, I've been there. Like certainly over the summer of 2021, I was going through some very cynical stages. It was a bit like a sort of stage of grief, really. And I'm sort of in a kind of acceptance phase now. I do genuinely. I mean, I don't know whether the stages of grief thing is a thing that's wildly unscientific and stupid, but um, I think it's a sort of helpful analogy for the way things are now. You do go through a grief stage, and then you do reach an acceptance stage, but you do also need to find the ways to make the best of the acceptance. And
Right.
this leads me on to a point I wanted to make, which is that because the geography of the political geography of the world is now not physically spatial, it's now psychological, and
Hmm.
because of that, people don't really have anywhere to go if they feel in this desperate state where they're so cynical of the world. They don't really have a place to go in their own vicinity. I mean, they might just look up on the internet, but their first port of call is the internet and not their own physical space. So people have been kind of geographically um, alienated in a way, or just politics in general is just geographically alienated or geographically sanitized
Hmm.
in a way that this is another thing that Hop, I think, is like something about it might have been Hop, I can't remember, something about the your mind being uh, the the realm of politics rather than geography, or something along those lines. And I think that's the if there is to be any constructive action, there would be a more kind of geographical significance to things, or some general uh, just more physical activity, more real activity, or more physical presences of things rather than just abstract presences. I mean, like we're sort of doing this talk across the Atlantic, that's something closer than this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like deliberately removing yourself from purely the hyperreal,
Exactly. Yeah. I think
cultivating local community. I mean, a lot of it comes down to what I would summarize as becoming more human.
exactly.
Uh,
That's the thing that's doable, because I mean it's difficult, but people who, if there was just like a random group of people who out in the world who happen, I mean, well, maybe they're throughout the United States, and the United States is very big, and they all decide, okay, we're all going to go and live in the same village or on the same street or in the same town we're all going to move so we're within walking distance of each other. That's obviously quite a strenuous thing, but that is something real that will actually transform people's lives and will make life worth living. And on a mass scale, it might actually turn into some, if taken to slightly more just greater extents, could turn into something even more politically significant. So
yeah.
just the mere fact that that sort of thing exists just makes it hard for me to be so extremely cynical.
Yeah, I think you see things like the Free State Project, right? New Hampshire is
Hmm.
starting the actual political change as a result of libertarians and anarchists moving there. I think over COVID has kind of accelerated the Great Sort, where conservatives are moving to red states, and the
And
liberals, the liberals
sure.
who aren't fleeing
Mm.
California, New York, are moving to blue areas.
And
Um,
in Canada, I mean, loads of people have been extremely. I think we've had a bit. I think a lot of people in Canada have had a bit of a shock they're all moving their money out of the big banks, and they're all moving. I don't know whether it's America and Canada or more Canada, but they're moving to more rural areas there. The thing that's picking up sort of is people moving to rural areas away from cities. I mean, yeah, that's fundamentally the thing. Cities are where you are closer to the even though obviously most politics is of the mind rather than the physical space, but cities are fundamentally more the centers of power than rural areas, and people are starting to move away from cities. I genuinely I think that's something that's picking up, and like yeah, go for it. That's not people aren't even doing that for their own sort of sophisticated philosophical reasons. It's just a kind of immediately obvious thing. You move away from the cities because the
Right.
cities are going to treat you like shit. Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to demean any of our city urban friends, but a lot of city living, let's say that collapse is approaching. If you have done the footwork to build an infrastructure for yourself in a rural area, and you learn how to become more and more self-sufficient, and find yourself a community of people that are actually your community and not just people you live next to, it makes it much more possible for you to thrive despite whatever the economy does.
That is just the way things have been
right.
in every pre-industrial age because they literally had to. That's not to say that that industrialization has just made things fundamentally worse on that front. Certainly, communities have existed in this way in the industrial age in countless places. So yeah, it's not just an industrial thing, but it's been facilitated more in recent times by, I mean, in my opinion, these certain kinds of post-war infrastructure policies where houses are just big infrastructure projects rather than built as a result of an immediate organic need confined to a specific place. No, they're just like, okay, build loads of houses here because whatever. I mean, that's just there's no roots there. It's complete, yeah. And also, yeah, something I wanted to say, I don't want to just denigrate cities because I mean, cities, they're a timeless phenomenon, or just generally, if some people are drawn to the place that they live in and grew up in, and that might be a city, and it's difficult for them to just move away like that. And
yeah,
we shouldn't just expect that people will be so willing to do that. It's in America. It's more of a thing that people are okay with just relocating. I think people are more likely to do that in America than in Britain and in Europe. And certainly it happens a lot does happen a lot in Europe, of course. But in America, it's just more of a thing.
right.
And but yeah, it's certainly true that not everyone can be expected to do that. And if they do live in a city and they really don't want to move away from it because they have a romantic fondness for it. In a city, you're more like you have a big plurality of people, so you're more likely to find your people, as it were. So, in that case, you would try and make an effort to find your common people and try and make something positive out of that, I suppose. But so yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think that wherever you are, I think right now is the time to start deliberately building community and culture between people. I think that a lot of our digital age, along with a lot of the good, has come this pathological abstraction of life. And I think that the route out of this involves reknitting social fabric that the past 100 years has been intent to dissolve in the name of liberation.
I mean, it's something that the the social media, the connectivity, and like the thing we are having right now, it is certainly been a great thing for me in particular, and for a lot of people who find themselves in these predicaments about whether they should just be cynical or and but it is, I suppose, finding ways to translate that into. I mean, I've also met physically with people who and tried to build friendships in a way, or build kind of networks of welfare, and not welfare, but we networks of well-being, or
Hmm.
check checks and balances sort of thing. I've done that a little bit in Britain, and it's it's great. It helps to make life more. I wouldn't say just make life more bearable, because obviously it's nice if life is bearable. Make life uh, just more um, real and authentic, and so yeah, there are always going to be these limitations with the purely social media aspect of things that people might not so obviously see. If and I think they need to force themselves to do more physical things, if in order to put things in better perspective, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess maybe another way to put it is resist the fake.
resist.
Resist the fake, which, as Havel would say, is live within the truth.
Live within the truth. Yes, and play more rock music. That's
Yeah.
specific thing that Harville points out is rock music is a great thing to, or just do more music. I mean, I'm a musician, so I don't need encouragement to do that. But music is great. Do more music. Oh
Absolutely.
God. Um. So yeah, we've been. Oh God, we're nearly going for 2 hours now, and I think. Do you think we'd be ready to wrap up now? Do you think?
Yeah, I think that this conversation has explored a lot of different stuff. So
Yes.
I
Yes.
think
We
happy to call it to a close.
Yes, and I want to thank you very much for coming on. I guess would you like to do a sort of concluding statement about everything, and give the people a good word?
Oh gosh. Well, I think that um, we are in a situation globally where a lot of um, a lot of the official patterns of information, of sense making, are in kind of free fall right now, and whatever the next regime looks like, um, I think that the only way to make sure that tomorrow looks better than today is to work actively to set yourself up as a quote unquote counter elite. Um, so, as a general rule, it means um, stop whining. You know what I mean? Like, I think that conservatives, broadly speaking, tend to complain about how unfair things are, um, or how hypocritical their enemies are. And uh, looking at a DeSantis who says, I don't care what they're going to say about me, I'm going to pursue what I believe to be the good. Um, he's serving as kind of an example. And it would be nice to see people rally around him, um, recognizing that we don't live in the world of the Constitution anymore, and we haven't for a long time. Um, and so recognizing that there are certain battles that are more important to win than others, uh, means recognizing what time it is. the cosmic clock. So that would be broadly my closing words, is like, don't black pill yourself. Don't think that action is impossible. Rather, recognize what time it is. Focus on improving who you are. Focus on building your community, and focus on rallying around leaders who are actually willing to stand up and not just get elected by saying one thing and then passively allowing the stream to move against you.
Thank you. No, that was very good. And I something that came to mind as you were saying that, which I think is worth saying, that a good system is always fundamentally going to be preceded by a good life, not the other way around. So create a good life, and obviously there's lots of limitations on you creating a good life, particularly and economically, financially, but there's always something you can do. And creating a good life is what will always be, despite the very cynical and bleak situation in the Western world, or the world at large, but particularly in the West, where you might otherwise expect it to be better because you're constantly bombarded with how great it is to be in the West. And that's not to say it isn't good to be in the West, but there are problems. There are pretty bleak problems, but creating a good life is always going to precede a good system. And which is a genuinely, particularly anti-fascist thing for me to say, where it is where the logic is reversed for fascism, and that's certainly why fascism is not going to be the answer to our problem. Oh my God, I went out of it. Sorry, let me get back on track. A good, yeah, oh God. Yes, and some general closing statements I'd like to make is be more aware of rituals in others, or rituals in the way the regime speaks to you, and ignore them. And don't take in everything, particularly information. See a lot of it as just rituals rather than something that you must care about. And also be more on the lookout for people that might be demonstrating the fact that they're living within the truth, as well as you living in the truth yourself. Obviously, what constitutes living in the truth is difficult to define, but fundamentally it comes from learning to spot rituals in others, which you will just learn to not invest any of your time in, and get out of the rituals yourself, and create a good life as best you can. And that is a good overall concluding statement to this discussion. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully we can have another discussion maybe sometime, and maybe have a more specific topic. I mean, we did have a sort of specific topic here, but we might do something that's more specified than just a continuation of this, where we just talked specifically about the regime. But yeah, thank you very much for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Marshall.
Thank you.
I am Darius Grouch the Third, the Rumble, and I am taking down the money plane. Now bring me my money.
Please hold on. Oh, yeah.